birds doing flyovers this weekend. They did that here at the church this morning with noises I've never heard before. Geese were flying over, doing a flyover over our house. I don't like this. I don't like what that might mean. Possibly it means another 6 months of this kind of weather. Possibly. Possibly. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in front of you. Just turn to page 1162. That makes it really easy. Most of us here have over our lifetime been on a church journey. Been in this church, been in this church, been in this church, for any number of reasons. I grew up as a kid. My grandfather was a lay pastor. And so in the summertime, my brother and I rode with him and my grandmother to church. And I was in the back seat of a Chrysler, fluid drive Chrysler. Some of you never heard of fluid drive. Yes? Okay. And then in the wintertime, we went to what became our home church where my mom and dad went. And a long time later, Carol and I moved to Virginia, where we went to a church. Instead of a couple hundred, it was 20,000 plus. That just means you sit in the same spot and you get to know 10 people. That's all you need to know. Then from there to South Carolina, back to Ontario, then to here. Every place you go is special, because you meet special folks. And part of a church journey, as you go to different churches, some churches are just really alive. That means the people are alive. Some churches you'll go to are dead. That just means the people in the church are dead. So you can kind of tell what you're at. The 10 reasons, according to Leadership magazine, 10 reasons that people leave churches, 6 of the 10 are relational reasons. It's people related why they leave a church, such as somebody wants to put a picture of Jesus in the foyer. We have a picture of Jesus over here. Somebody thought we should put it in a prominent spot here. We just haven't found the prominent spot yet. So some people, that's a big issue. Apparently in this church, it was a big issue. Putting a picture of Jesus, even though nobody's absolutely sure what he looked like. That they thought that's what should happen. And another reason that they said was they had a petition that went around that all church staff should be clean shaven. I guess they hadn't read the Old Testament or the New Testament. Another was a request, oh, I've heard this one, that all leaders be dressed in suits to serve communion. Nobody here hopes that, right? And then here's my favorite. Can you imagine? They allowed deviled eggs to be at the church potluck supper. Deviled eggs. Amen. Young pastors and young pastors sleep this way. It was wonderful to be that way. This young pastor went to a church in the West, and he thought he could turn it around. That's the beauty of being young. You think you can, you don't all rest on you. So he tried this, and he tried that, and leadership always shot his ideas down. No, that won't work. No, we've tried that before. And finally, in frustration, he put this big ad in the Saturday paper and named the church and said, the church is dead. Tomorrow we're having a funeral service. And they packed the church. And he had a casket at the front. And so he got up and he gave the eulogy and said, this is kind of the story and the history of the church. And he went through it all. And then he came around and opened the casket and invited people to come and pay their respects. When they come down, they would all kind of turn their heads, because at the bottom of the casket was a large-sized mirror. They saw themselves. They saw themselves. Now, interesting. When you personalize that, a troubled church is a sign of a troubled family. And in this passage, this is an amazing passage in Philippians chapter 4. Paul here is talking to the church at Philippi, and as he talks to them, he immediately is changing his tone from chapter 3 to chapter 4. And here, Paul now shares his heart. We often call it a pastor's heart. And in chapter 4, verse 1, notice what Paul says. Therefore, my brothers, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, that is how you should stand in the Lord, dear friends. So he shares his heart and he says, first of all, brothers. We're brothers and sisters. We're part of the family of God. And so we're a family. We often refer to ourselves as the family of God because that's exactly who we are. And so when we come to church as family. And Paul said, my brothers. He stresses the strong tie that binds them together. And then he says, whom I love, a form of agape love. It's the idea of unconditional love I have for you. And I long for you. The only time that it's mentioned in the New Testament. And he says here, I long for you. Now, if you've been in churches and you have fond memories, you long to see again those people that you develop friendships with or that you have relationships with. You always wonder how they're doing, and you'd love to reconnect with them. And so Paul says, I long for you. He said, I long for you and I miss you. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in the church you're going to meet is going to guarantee that you're going to long for them. But there's going to be a whole bunch of them that you are going to long for. And Paul longs for their fellowship. And then he says, thirdly, my joy and my crown. My joy. That is, you have made my life so much better. You brought joy to my life. And because of connecting with you and fellowshipping with you and ministering with you, Paul says, you have filled my life with joy. You are my joy. Life was better because of them. And then he says, uses the crown imagery. And he speaks of the crown here as the idea of a reward. So in the Olympic Games in Greece, if you're winning, and usually a race involved, if you won, you would get this wreath that they would place on your head. And that meant that you were a winner. And so Paul says, my reward, when I get home to heaven, my reward is going to be you. What an amazing statement to make. So if some of you have been influenced along the way, and you have been transformed and changed your life, and got turned around, and now you are right with God, and you're at peace with God, and you're going home to glory, Paul says, that's my reward in knowing that I had a little part in that. And so as he goes through that, he says, now, Paul knew the church at Philippi at this point for about 10 years. He hasn't seen them in about 5 years. And so when he thinks about them, he's longing for them, and he's thinking about to them, and his whole idea here is on the whole idea of unity as he thinks about fellowship with them. Now, this is how Jesus said it. He said, my prayer is that all of them, that meaning the disciples, and the message that went out from the disciples all the way down to you and I, that all of us may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they, meaning us, also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me. May they be brought to complete unity to let the Lord know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Wow. So Paul is saying here, every church needs a big heart. Every church needs a big heart. Trent and I were talking about this in an area this week, and I said to Trent, I've always wrestled with the one side feeling gullible and the other side feeling legalistic. Who do you help? Who don't you help? Where do you bend? Where don't you bend? I can remember I had two professors at Liberty. One taught a very strict position on a subject. The other professor taught a little looser position on a topic. And I'm like, couldn't you have got together and made it a whole lot easier? It was the best thing that ever happened, because I spent that summer studying scripture and came to this conclusion. There's going to be lots of times in life when you're just not sure. And when you're not sure, I decided I'd sooner be on the side of helping people if I'm not sure. The Lord will take care of the rest if your heart's right. So Paul says here, he shares his heart. And he says every church needs a big heart. You know, that's amazing truth, love. Paul said, my love for you, when we talk about the attributes of God, do you ever notice that love is always what's talked about? Do you know what? Love is the greatest attribute of God. It's greater than holiness. It's greater than faithfulness. Do you know why? God is invisible. And so people will say to you, you believe in God. Like, who is this God you're talking about? Have you ever seen him? Love makes God visible. That's why love is such a great attribute of God. And so the love of God, when you experience the love of God, you know that God is real. And so Paul says, my love for you, I long for you. You're my joy and you're my crown. And then he balances that as he moves on. But let's go back to the beginning of the verse. He says, therefore. Now, if you are a student of the scripture, you know that when you see the word therefore, you look to see what it's there for. Now, what is it there for? Now, back up to verse 20 of the previous chapter. And verse 20 says, now, our citizenship is in heaven. He said, our citizenship is in heaven. And we're awaiting the Lord. That's what we're awaiting. We're not awaiting an event, we're awaiting a person. We often tie it to an event, but the most important thing, Jesus is coming. And Jesus is coming, and our citizenship is in heaven. And then he says, and he's going to transform us. He's going to transform your lowly body to a glorious body. So you're getting an upgrade. Turn to the person beside you and say, I'm getting an upgrade. Because that's exactly what's going to happen. You are getting an upgrade. And having said this, Paul goes on and he says, now, let me share my heart. And then he says, let me challenge you. That is how you should stand firm. Stand firm in the Lord. Stand firm is mentioned 14 times in the New Testament. It's a balance between having a big heart and standing firm, dear friends. All of us could talk about people that we've seen follow the Lord, and they've fallen by the wayside along the way because there's lots of things you'll see along the way that'll discourage you. Lots of things you'll see along the way that'll turn you off. Paul says, no, stand firm. Perhaps a military term with significance to the city of Philippi being a military town with military families. Now, we like stability. He says, now stand firm, steadfastness. We like stability. But all of us are plagued with entropy. We're breaking down. I know some of you are looking a little bit older. You ever notice that? You see somebody and you say, like, have you noticed them? I can't believe how much they've aged. They're actually saying the same thing about you, but you don't know that, and that's good. But we all have entropy. Now, it's interesting. You go back to the 20th century. Imagine people that came into the 20th century and what they saw in the 20th century. Mind-boggling the changes they saw. Imagine if you started out with a horse and buggy and ended up driving a car. Now come to the 21st century. They're talking now about the car driving you. I said at home, this is going to be a great invention because it's going to come just in time for me. I can go out, jump in the car, and it'll take me to Tim Hortons and Jet May. Our daughter said, no, it won't, Dad, because you'll never figure out how to program it. That wasn't a lot of encouragement. Now, it's amazing how fast things are changing. No longer loyalty from company to employee. No longer loyalty from employee to company. And on it goes. That's on the physical side. Go over to the spiritual side. And on the spiritual side, when you look over there, the world is tempting. The flesh is vulnerable. The devil is lion-like. And so when you come to even church life, there's going to be some instability as a result of that. So we need internal stabilizers to navigate the 21st century. I'm looking around. One of the first times I've been glad that our pilot from Air Canada isn't here, because I'd like to use an illustration of airplanes. He probably could correct me if I should check this with him. Airplanes navigate in turbulence. If you ever rode an airplane, you probably know a wee bit. You get turbulence here and there. It's interesting when my understanding is they have internal stabilizers. The tail is the primary stabilizer. The horizontal fins is what keeps it from going up and down. The vertical fins is what keeps it from going sideways, back and forth. And the principle that Paul is using here for us, again at the end of verse 1, is, now you need to stand firm, and now notice what he says. In the Lord. In the Lord. That's the principle that he's giving to us at the beginning of this chapter. In the Lord, dear friends. In other words, the principle is this. Use big truth in everyday places. Use big truth in everyday places. I'll make that come clear to you. Let's say that together. Use big truth in everyday places. One more time. Use big truth in everyday places. Now, what is Paul saying here when he's talking about, now, not only do you have to have a big heart, but you need to learn big truth so that you can stand. Paul now moves to turbulence in the church. The number one problem in ministry, interesting, isn't that interesting? It's people. What a shocker. And I've been in the church long enough to know it is almost always turf wars. Almost always. Somebody's, well, we should be doing this. Somebody, well, we should be doing that. Whatever your personal agenda is. But why in the church? Because we're a group of confessed sinners. That's who we are. Paul said it another time, he said it this way. He said, now the entire law is summed up in a single command. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, if you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you'll be destroyed by each other. And then he goes on, he says, live by the Spirit. Be led by the Spirit. Show the fruit of the Spirit. And so, what is he saying there? He says, we're a group of confessed sinners. We're a group of commandment breakers as well. We've broken, actually, all of the commandments. And we're needy. We're a group of personal agendas. And we need to learn to live by being led by the Spirit. So Paul then goes on, and now he zeroes in on a private matter. Paul says, now I want to deal with a matter in the church. In verse 2, he says this. I plead with Euodia, I plead with Syntyche, to agree with each other in the Lord. Now, when I say those words, you'll never remember their names. So let me say what their names really mean. Euodia, I think it really means, there you go again. That was her real name. And the other one's name was Syntyche. So you got there you go again, and over here you got Syntyche. Now they're in the church, and can you believe it? A conflict arises. Now one's name means lucky, the other one's name means success. Lucky means that she's going to be more impulsive, take more chances. Success is going to be more guarded, more methodical. Imagine they see things differently. And so here are these two gals, and they're having a disagreement. The church should be a place where people support each other, where they hold each other accountable, where they care for one another, and they take a stand in healing divisions. But you need a big heart, and you need a firm stand. And so Paul says, I've had enough of this, and it needs to get resolved. Something's happened. It says these women are prominent, because notice it goes on in verse 3, and says, yes, and I ask you, loyal yoke fellow, help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers. We don't know who they are because they're not mentioned. They may well be the elders of the church, whose names are in the book of life. That's the register where God keeps the names of the redeemed. He said that's important because their names are there, and that's the most important place for them to be. So he says, now these gals, I don't know who these gals are, but I know who I'd like to think these gals are. Remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul goes into Philippi. There's no synagogue. You have to have 10 Jewish men to have a synagogue. They don't have that. So he goes down to the riverside, and some Jewish women down there having a prayer meeting. So Paul goes down, and remember he leads Lydia to the Lord. I'd like to think these two sisters were part of that group, but we don't know for sure. Wouldn't it be great to think that the church was founded not on the four fathers, but maybe it was founded on the four mothers. And that's how the church was founded. We just don't know for sure. But something happens, and here they're having an issue. Now, there was a pastor in the church was speaking on a subject such as this. And he said, okay, so we need to deal with this, he said. So he said, I want you to look around in the congregation to somebody you can't stand. And he says, and I want you to make a chocolate cake tonight. And I want you to take that chocolate cake to that person's house and put it on their porch. He says, will you do that? So yeah, they agreed to do that. The next morning, the pastor's wife was leaving the house, went out on the porch, and she screamed. The pastor says, what's the matter? She said, there's 14 chocolate cakes on the porch. Now, I'm okay with that. I can get over that. Michael Bentley asked if your name was found in a 100-year-old document. Think of that. I've seen people take a church bulletin and say, I'm going to put this in such and such a wall of a renovation I'm doing. Be interesting to see who comes on it years later. Your name in a 100-year-old document. Michael Bentley's question is this: how would you like that person to feel about you when they read your name in that document? Now, these two gals are never mentioned again in Scripture, but they're always remembered. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about, there you go again, and soon touchy, because they're having a conflict. And Paul calls names and he calls them out. But then he gives the solution back in verse 1. Stand firm in the Lord. In the Lord. There's always your viewpoint, and there's the Lord's viewpoint. He takes a social issue and moves it to a spiritual issue. He takes it from a horizontal perspective to a heavenly perspective. It's not how you think about it. It's how does he think about it. And that's, as the principle we looked at, and the principle that we said, and that the principle that we used there was this. You take big truth and you use it in everyday places. So Paul says, now come back to, here's the solution. You got this issue going on. He doesn't name what's going on other than there's friction. Doesn't name how it started. But he names it to say these are the gals. And he says that you can't have unity in a church with this going on. You can't have outreach in a community with this going on. He said, so it needs to be dealt with. And so he said, this is the solution. You take it to a heavenly perspective. The Psychiatric Association said that they asked people in an orchestra what they thought of each other. Now, if you are playing an instrument, this is a little brutal. Orchestra, when asked opinions of each other, this is what they said. They said the percussionists, well, they're insensitive, they're unintelligent, they're hard of hearing, but they're sure fun-loving. I'm glad they added that last part. String players, well, they're arrogant and they're stuffy and they're unathletic. Brass, they're just loud. Woodwind, they're held in the highest esteem. They're quiet, they're meticulous, but they're egotistical. Now, if that's what you think of each other in an orchestra, how in the world do you ever get together to make the beautiful sound that an orchestra makes? It happens this way. They get down in the pit, put the music in front of them, and they let go of their biases, and their focus goes on the conductor. And the conductor leads them. That's exactly the same answer for us. It doesn't make any difference what you think of this person or that person or the other person. It matters that your focus is on the conductor. Remember, Jesus said, follow me. He didn't say follow them. He said, follow me. And so, Paul says, to make beautiful music. And then he shares two concerns. Notice verses 4 and 5. He says this. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. Maintain a spirit of joy. Rejoice. Our joy is in the Lord, and it is unchanging. Rejoice is a personal choice to react to life's uncertainty with faith. Life is going to be tough, and it is, but God is good. And so you focus on the promises of God. If you're at the bottom, what is the promise? My God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory through Christ Jesus. You can go on and on through the promises of God. And as you're going through those promises of God, you can rejoice that God, by faith, is going to meet those needs, whatever they are. And then in verse 5, he adds this. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Learn to be content, to be gentle. Learn to be gracious. The humble graciousness that produces patience. A gentle touch with a sweet reasonableness. Remember how Proverbs says it? Proverbs says a soft answer will turn away wrath. And so Paul says, you need to have a spirit of joy, but you need to have a contentment as well, because you have a humble graciousness about you. And then he adds, the Lord is near. The Lord is near. What does he mean by that? It could mean the Lord is near in time, and that would be the usual interpretation. Or it might mean the Lord is near in space. The Lord is near in time would mean that the Lord's coming back. And when the Lord comes back, he knows that you're supposed to have applied these things to your life. So remember that, because he's coming back. Or it could mean that the Lord is near as in space, meaning he's with you. He goes to church with you. Imagine God goes to church with you through the Spirit of God. And so he's near to you. And remember that the Lord is near, and so he can help you with your joy, and he can help you with your graciousness. Tim was Christian, was a leader, he was mature. And he said that when he was having conversations with other people, especially guys, he noticed conversations would often go negative. They would often talk about churches and, oh, have you heard about such and such a church? Or have you heard about such and such a church? And then it would go negative, and he said, I really got smitten one time with all of that. And he said it was as if the Lord opened my eyes and I saw a bride and groom. And he said, so I'm at this wedding. And I walk up to the groom, and I lean into the groom, and I say to the groom, wow, your bride sure isn't very attractive. And then he said, I thought, I would never say that. I can't imagine anybody saying that. And then the Lord said, well, think about me. The church is my bride. And every time that you're knocking the church, you're saying, my bride isn't very attractive. Jesus said, follow me. He didn't say, follow them. He said, follow me. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, of that, Lord, cultivate harmony amongst us, that we might stand firm. That, Lord, that we might look at things not horizontally, always wanting my way. We might look at things heavenward. Lord, what is it that you desire? As we do so, Lord, fill our lives with joy and